Good morning, everyone. Let's try this one more time. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
That's a little better. Well, so we're going to be covering 1 Timothy chapter 5 today, or this morning, as we get through everything here. It's kind of an interesting little chapter. We're going to have Paul talking to Timothy. He's going to be talking about kind of the relationships inside the church. How to treat certain people, how to take care of certain people, and when to treat certain people different ways. And so we look really within kind of the first part of it, two kind of parts of the chapter. The first one is really dealing with all the members of the congregation, how they're going to treat each other. The second half, near the end, is more so just some advice to Timothy individually, just Paul speaking to someone he cares about, and giving him some advice about how to be, when you really get to it, how to walk, how to think, how to just take care of himself. And so we really get into the first verse, and we'll read it real quick here. It says, "But do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, all in purity." So these first two, it's just this real general about just how to treat each other. And it seems really simple, doesn't it? Right? We treat each other like what? Like family. Like a father, like brothers, like sisters, like mothers, like family. Now, okay, let's back up a little bit. Okay, not like brothers tend to treat brothers, or brothers tend to treat little sisters sometimes. But, as we get older, we cherish the relationships we have with our brothers and our sisters, our fathers and our mothers. And what we need to be doing is treating each other that same way, when we look at each other. So as we're talking to each other, when it comes time to correct somebody, we don't just stand up. And the example given here, if we put it in today's vernacular, stupid old man, no. An encouraging word. It's not about rebuking somebody and being cruel. It's encouraging people. So we encourage each other. We look to each other as if we're family. And I really like how he says there in the end, what's the real catch to working with each other? In all purity. So he says there, in all purity. So again, that's how we drive the relationship, that we look at each other, we treat each other like family, and we're doing it with pure intentions. It's not, for our own gain or for anything. It's not to put somebody down. It's not to raise ourselves up. It's just the purity of caring for somebody else and wanting things to be, be right, that everybody be right the way they should be. Then he steps into, and he's going to spend some considerable time talking about widows. Now, there's a difference here. The widow, as a general word, is just a woman who has lost her husband. Okay. Which is a little different these days than it was in Timothy and Paul's day. I remember talking with somebody about when my grandfather passed away, my mom's dad. And we were just talking, and she says, "Wow, I hope she had a great insurance policy." I said, "My grandfather didn't have any life insurance." And, "Well, it's so terrible." I'm, "Well, how is it so terrible?" She's left with a paid-off house, 2 paid-off cars, several bunches of acres of land, and a bunch of cash in the bank. Financially, she's fine. She lived comfortably for the rest of her days till she passed away several years later. And even then, the insurance policies, generally speaking, most of us do have a life insurance policy of some sort, so that if I pass away, Candy becomes a relatively comfortable woman once she gets over grieving for me day and night for years on end, right? Just making sure that's going to happen. So as society changes a little bit, the true definition of a widow, as Paul was talking about, versus a widow as we talk about today, is a little different. Because, as a husband might pass away, a woman left behind, a widow, might come into hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on what kind of policies, what kind of things are set up for a person. In Paul's day, that's not so. Typically, you get what we would consider a middle-aged man passes away. She has nothing. In their society, they didn't really own a lot of property. It was kind of rare to be Dorcas, to be an independent businesswoman. And so if a woman's husband passed away, she's left a widow, and she's left with with nothing at all. Shouldn't have an exorbitant life insurance policy. There's not a lot of money in the bank that she can live off for the rest of her days. Depending on what kind of business her husband was in, perhaps she's left without any sort of income at all. Maybe possessions they had are, shifted off to somebody else. And that wasn't uncommon. This was something that's true. And this is what he's talking about when she's talking about honor widows who are truly widows, or widows indeed, depending on what translation you've got. So the difference being is that you have a woman or a widow of means versus a widow without means. And this is where he gets into this how we should treat them. And so he says there in verse 4, he talks about, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. Okay, if you got family to take care of you, they need to take care of you. This is less about the widow, as more as it's about the family. It's in pleasing God, it's taking care of family. Again, a little different society now than it is now than it was then. Now, just far too many people, and I know there are plenty of reasons to do this legitimately, but far too many people, as soon as dad dies, mom goes where? Nursing home somewhere and, shipped off and left alone. Now, there are legitimate reasons when somebody needs extreme medical care that you just cannot provide. We get that. Everybody understands that. But there are those that just ship them off because I don't want to deal with mom, or I don't want to deal with dad. Let's go both sides of this coin for that matter. And what he's talking about here is if you have somebody that you can take care of them, take care of them. Show godliness. He says there. And it's a way to learn piety at home. Repay your parents is kind of what he says there. He says there to make some return to their parents. They took care of you. Take care of them. This is kind of the circle of the way things work. Well, I don't want to do stuff like they didn't want to do stuff like that for you either. I don't want to deal with diapers. They dealt with mine. Okay, if I have to deal with theirs, then so be it. But we take care of our family. And so, again, he's just, if you have family to take care of you, they're supposed to take care of you. And that's not even just an exhortation to how a widow should be with her family, but how the family should be. So as he's talking to the people of the church here, make sure that you're not just shoving the old folks off on somebody else, as some might look at that attitude. But no, we care for each other. And especially in this deal where we have a woman who has lost her husband, she doesn't have income, she doesn't have property, she needs something, and guess what she has? You. She has the family. And he kind of goes into, in verses 5 and 6, he starts contrasting about someone who is a true widow. And in verse 6, he talks about the opposite of that. In verse 5, he says, she who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. So somebody who is alone, which we talked about, there's true widow. She doesn't have her children to take care of her. She doesn't have a husband anymore, and she's trusting in God. This is a true widow. This is somebody that the church, as he's talking to them, honor them, or as he's going to say here in a few minutes, or just a few moments, possibly support should they need it, to help them, to feed them, to clothe them, to do what needs to be done for them. But he makes the contrast there to someone in verse 6. He says there, but she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. So he makes this contrast about somebody who has realized that I have nothing but God. I put all my faith in God. And then you have, this would be the young woman who loses her husband, but she still has all the property and all the money, and she's just indulging herself by letting somebody else take care of her. She's capable, but she won't. And so this is someone just says she is dead while she lives. So we get the true difference here. And so he contrasts the true widow versus the widow who's not. And what he commands them here in verse 7, he's talking about that he wants everyone to be without reproach. And part of this really kind of links back to the world is looking at us. Every day, every move we make, every move we don't make, the world is looking at us, and they are, unfortunately, judging all of us by the few of us. And so what he wants to do is make sure that we're taking care of the people we need to take care of so that there's not reproach brought upon the church. Nobody has anything that they can look and say, yeah, see, they say they're so pious, but they're not even taking care of their mothers. So we're trying to avoid that. He wants to make sure that people are doing this so that we can be without reproach. And then he throws out this verse here. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for the members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. King James chooses the infidel word. When we don't take care of our families, we don't provide, it's interesting here, for our relatives and especially for our own household, those who live with us, you have to take care of them. And those family members that don't live with us, you have to take care of them. That's what we do. And so as we see, our grandfather needs help with something, go help them. Provide what needs to be provided for them. He says, I love it, especially for the members of his own household. If you're not feeding your kids, you're worse than an infidel. You've denied the faith. There's no point in claiming to be a Christian if you're not taking care of your family. Our families need to be taken care of. And Paul is you think about the way this word comes out. You've denied the faith. You're worse than an unbeliever. This is kind of, you go back to, somebody who believes and then denies it. It'd have been better if they'd have just never been born, kind of thing. Unbelieving. You don't believe. That's a bad thing. But if you claim to believe and then you don't act in such a way you believe, you're worse than that, he says there. He actually puts a degree to it. And the problem really becomes, back up into verse 7, when you don't take care of your family, you bring reproach on yourself. You bring reproach on what you claim to be. So if you claim to be a Christian and you don't feed your kids, you bring reproach on the church. Is that how the church acts? That's how people start talking. And we have to avoid bringing reproach on the church, ourselves, or our brothers and sisters. Because again, everything we do and everything we don't do is watched by the world, and the whole group of us is judged by the few of us, unfortunately. We have to watch out for that.
Sometimes that verse does bring a lot of guilt when the person that you are trying to take care of needs more care than what you can actually give. And then sometimes people will hang on to people to take care of them when they should have professional help because of the guilt that they feel there.
Yeah, there's, I remember this is, getting back into my family, my great-grandfather had a disorder where it looked like Alzheimer's, but it wasn't. It was basically a blood blockage to his brain. So he was forgetful. He got to where he really couldn't take care of himself. And my grandmother plowed her garden over, put a foundation down, put him a really nice double wide on the back of her property where she and my grandfather are, and it was 20 feet from their house. And even then, she got to where she couldn't take care of him as much as he needed taken care of. She had to hire help in. And so there was a lady or two that switched shifts to be with them, or to be with him and to take care of him. I mean, to the point where to get him out of bed needed a crane kind of thing. He was not well. And she looked at all my aunts and uncles and my father and said, if I get that way, I need to go over here. You can't do what we're having to do for her dad. And so she tries to alleviate some of that guilt because she knows what that feels like. But, when it comes to it, we need to make sure family is taken care of. Otherwise, again, we bring the reproach. And again, you get into a point where you are, where you need that extra help, that extra care, something that you just physically cannot take care of or don't have the expertise to take care of. Well, the trick is, don't just toss them and forget about them. That was her thing. You can put me in a home, but just, you have to come visit me. Just, that kind of thing. And again, it really comes down to we're taking care of family. It's kind of that shift where he was talking about the church as family. Now he's talking about the family itself. So then he starts and he gets into the nitty-gritty and the details about taking care of widows. Again, we're coming back to a widow being a woman who doesn't have family to take care of her, doesn't have the means to take care of herself. At this point, the church can step in and take care of her. This is getting the things that she needs, getting all the, feeding, somewhere to live, clothes to wear, these kinds of things. And so he starts talking about, okay, there are some requirements here. And so he digs into those in verse 9. And in verse 9 he says, let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. So there's an age requirement. Needs to be at least 60 years old. And part of this is as we're younger, okay, we can remarry, we can do some work. Remember that there was, and this is still society at the time, there was a welfare system of sorts, the gleaning of the crops. You remember Ruth and her mother-in-law. They would glean, or Ruth would go out and glean. She was young and able, and so there was a way to get food. But as we get older, it gets a little more difficult to get around and go glean in the fields, right? So this is at this point where we're starting. There's a problem here. You're not able to get out and do things, especially at a point where nowadays we live a little older and we live a lot easier. We don't really tear our bodies up to survive every day. People in different times, especially back in older times, they really tore their bodies up to make a living. I think it's terrible if I got to work 9 hours one day sitting in my air-conditioned office typing up documents and reviewing policies and processes. What a drain. These people would work 15, 16, 17, 18 hours in a field, and they didn't get the weekends off, nor bank holidays. They really tore themselves up. And so as they get older, the wear and tear happens a lot sooner. And so here he says, you can still work, and great. So once you're a certain age, once you're 60, man, there's not a lot of employment options for you. So this is at a point when the church can start taking care of you. The wife of one man. I had a little trouble making sure I understood this one correctly. Was it, that you'd only been married once? Had you been married twice, maybe 3 times, whatever the case be? The Pharisees' question about the Sadducees' question about this woman was married and married and married and married kind of thing. But the idea here being that this is not somebody who just went from marriage to marriage, just gaining up. And part of it comes back to, occasionally a woman could come out of a marriage as a widow with some property. And this is kind of the safeguard against that. It's not somebody who's just a serial monogamist who just moved on from one to another. And then he even goes the idea about her reputation. That she's reported to have done good works, that she has a good reputation, that she's brought up children, that she's hospitable, she's lodged strangers. She takes care of people. It says they're washed the saints' feet, and part of this is back to Jesus talking about the washing of the feet. Humble. I can just think mostly out of movies and just stereotypes of old Southern women. They're very prideful. And I never took this, and I will not take your charity. And again, this is just movie stereotypes. But you get the idea there that somebody who is humble, who is willing to do the lowest job of the lowest servant of the house. It's the willingness and the humility of it. She's received the afflicted. This is somebody who cares for the sick, who cares for those that are having problems, and that she's devoted to every good work. She is just dedicated to the good work of the church. This is somebody who's willing to, again, just take care of people, and who's willing to work for the church. And so these are people, he says they're those that can be enrolled. And the idea there is somebody who can be taken care of. by the church, somebody that the funds that the church has put together or whatever is collected by the church can be used to help them out. Now, how that's done, a monthly check, a house, and a gift card to Walmart for clothes and groceries, that's expediency thing. I work that out, as a congregation, but the idea is that they're to be taken care of.
Steve, it says if she has brought up children, that means she just got one, the church wouldn't be responsible? Because I know congregations that will not make elders and deacons if they ain't got more than one child. It reads the same way for the widow. The children is pure, but if they just got one, would that widow not have, they wouldn't be responsible for their mother or grandmother or what it be? How do you feel about that?
I hate the way I feel about it. Now, really, if she's brought up children, so this idea is
but
that...
Just got one.
Yeah.
In the scriptures, a lot of times the word children can be singular.
And that's true, and that's something I would, that's kind of to what we're starting to think about, was I'd have to look a little bit more back at the language of, how that got translated from child to children. Sometimes, the same way that God created man, or what it means to be men and women. And so the plurality can be a little different sometimes. I will defer that answer for more research. But it typically, she's raised up children, and this is, I'm thinking here, again, a societal thing that typically, now it's like, great, we're going to have a kid, and we're done. But especially then, man, we're rolling kids. I mean, we're just having kids as much as we can. Because one, you wanted to grow the family, you needed help with the work. I know kids are an expensive labor force, but and so typically you wouldn't find, it was very rare to find someone with just one child. And so that's kind of one thing. I'll get Tom first real quick.
If you look at verse 10, it says, "And having a reputation for good works, and then it lists some, that to me indicates these are indicative of somebody who has a reputation for good works. Not that you need to check off each and every one, but these are the things you would expect to find in a person who has a reputation for good works."
That's an excellent point there. Kind of, that's where punctuation is important. The idea of good works, and good works is the kind of brought by bringing up children, showing hospitality, being humble, and part of it is brought up children, and that's kind of important too. It's not just had kids and let them run. She raised her kids. She taught them right, and that's kind of part of it as well. It's not just a matter of here's a child on the world, you go have fun, but that she raised her child, she taught them, she nurtured them. These are good works that she's talking about. Yeah.
I worked with a man many years ago. He only had one child. He sinned to left him. He was brought up in the church, and he wanted to be an elder real bad. But the church in Norwood, Church of Christ in Norwood, never would make him elder because of the one child. Now, I disagree with that, but I think if a widow had one child and she fit the qualifications otherwise, like in those days the church would take care of her, I don't think they could get out of it because she just had one child.
I think the same way you think, and I put that right there. I think. So as much salt as you want to put on that to get that out. But I'll have to study some more on it to kind of look at what they mean. Is children plural? Is it singular? How does the translation work out? What does it originally mean? So that'll take some work on my part to get that, and I haven't studied because I've never faced it before, so I can't speak on it completely.
But raising a child, it doesn't have to be your own child. It takes a village to raise a child. We're all raising each other's children here in classes as we teach them God's word. Our neighbors are helping raise our children as they watch out for each other in the neighborhood. Our families are helping raise our children. with our interactions with them. It's not just raising your own children, it's raising everybody's children.
And that's an excellent point. It doesn't say she brought up her children, whether she's brought up children. Maybe they're orphans she's taking care of, fostering children, taking care of children from other parts of the family. There's a lot that could be going into that because it's not specific about bringing up her own children. But perhaps it was somebody that she took care of. And said orphans were I don't want to say a terrible problem, because orphans aren't a terrible problem. The fact that children are orphaned is a terrible problem, and it happened even more so then, especially in violent times. And they were living in violent times. So lots of children left without parents. Who took care of them? Maybe godly women like this as a possibility. He does talk about the younger widows and why they shouldn't be supported by the church. He says there, but to refuse in verse 11, refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. And this idea here is that, a woman is widowed at a very young age, and the church starts supporting her, and so she's being taken care of, and then she sees some fella and decides she's going to get married again. And it says there this idea that for when their passions draw them away from Christ. And typically the idea here is talking about just a woman, just like a young man. Kind of our desires, our passions kind of float hither and whither every once in a while. Not just towards the opposite sex, but towards, maybe different entertainment pursuits or different job pursuits, these kinds of things. So our passions change from time to time. And while younger people are less grounded than older folks tend to be, don't set them up to not have to work for themselves. Don't set them up to not have to be able to do things for themselves. Again, you've got don't go pay the bills of a young woman who's widowed, because she can still work, and it's part of her responsibility to take care of herself, as just the same as it is for a man to go out and make sure that things are taken care of. And so what the concern here is that as your desires change, and think about it, like I said, Candy would just be just weeping and wailing for years on end, right? No, at some point she would get over me and her desires would change. And, great, that's a wonderful thing. But because of that, Candy's not eligible as a young woman, you're welcome, honey, to be supported by the church, because her desires will change. It's just human nature. He doesn't want them to cast off their faith for that. And then there's some counsel for them. And it's not just like, nope, can't support you. He's going to give them some advice. He says there in verse 14, so I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. So what do you do as a young widow? Go remarry. Go live. Go live. Go have kids. Go out and manage your household. Be that fruitful woman. Go out there and just do what needs to be done. And it says there again, give the adversary no occasion for slander. Don't give any room for reproach. Is that how a Christian acts? That question gets asked. Give no room for that. And it says here, even it goes on a little farther. If that you have widows with believing children in verse 16, if a believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Don't let the church be burdened so that it may care for those who are truly widows. And so it comes down to needs versus what somebody would want. Somebody who truly needs the church's help should get that help, while somebody who has somebody to take care of them. Or, if you need to, much like in Ruth's position, take care of the widow that's in your family. And so, again, it's taking care of each other. And the priority comes that the family takes care of family, and the church takes care of those without family. That's kind of how that works out. Now we'll step into, this is kind of right along with where we are in the process of things here at Summit for a while. And in verses 17 through 20, he kind of shifts gears. He shifts gears into how to work with elders. Again, not with necessarily the older folk of the congregation, but with those who are ruling the congregation. We're talking about the pastors, the presbyters, the bishops, whatever word we want to use for them. It says here in verse 17 that we should let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and the laborer deserves his wages." Now this double honor, in context with everything, he's saying it is perfectly okay that an elder who rules well can be supported by the church, can be paid for his work. And he says there, really, especially those who are laboring in word and doctrine. And what I've always heard, you got an elder who's preaching full time, yeah, help them out. But it's not necessarily an elder who's preaching full time, but someone who's laboring in the word and doctrine. Again, this is somebody who might have given up a career to do the work of the church, who spends, their 40 hours a week in the homes of the congregation, who spends it out teaching somewhere, who spends it just doing the work of the church. And the scriptural basis he gives for that really is right there. For the scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox." This is some Old Testament bringing forth here, or bringing forward to kind of make the point. You don't muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. And it was an old practice, what you'd have to do is, you got this ox that's going through the grain, pulling all your farm implements as you're harvesting. And what people would sometimes do is put a muzzle on them. Because what does an ox do when it walks through the grain? It takes a couple bites, doesn't it? It says you're getting the bulk of it back here, but this ox is taking a bite every once in a while. And they would muzzle them so they couldn't eat any of the grain. But it says here, and this is Old Testament again, you don't muzzle your ox. If they're working for you, they need to eat. And so, yeah, you lost a little of your crop to the person making it, easy for you to get your crop. And the idea here is that also that the laborer is worthy of his wages. Nobody likes to work for free. Nobody likes to go hungry because they're spending all their time working. And so, as we have perhaps an elder that spends all of their time, they've given up their livelihood to work for the church. They're preaching, they're teaching, not necessarily from a pulpit. They're worthy of the double honor. They're worthy of taking some pay without, thinking badly about it or getting hard feelings about it. They're worthy of it. It says there in verse 19, even goes a little farther when it comes to the treatment of elders. "Do not admit a charge against an elder, except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses." And this is kind of interesting, as you spend a lot of time vetting a person to become an elder. This is not something that's taken lightly. Nobody walks up and says, "I think I want to be an elder." No, you want to be an elder. And the congregation doesn't look at them and go, "I think I want them to be an elder." No, they've looked at them enough that they know they're an elder. This is a person of high moral standing, high, biblical standing. And so when somebody comes up and says, "I saw Tom stone drunk out of his mind Friday night," what's my first thought? Oh, I gotta go tell Ken. Did you hear about Tom? Or what do I say? No. One person comes to me telling me they saw Tom stone drunk out of his brain Friday. I have no reason to believe that whatsoever. And a matter of fact, it says, do not admit it. Don't entertain it. Don't take it seriously. Now, I'm going to need to spend some time correcting somebody. Hey, let's talk about this for a second, because I think you're mistaken. But if he says, if I got 2 or 3 people telling me that Tom was stone drunk out of his mind Friday night, then I need to go talk to Tom about his drinking problem, because we got 2 or 3 witnesses about it. And so we don't receive it, we don't entertain it, we don't accept it unless there's a serious accusation of 2 or 3 witnesses. Just one person making these wild accusations against somebody, they're just that. They're just wild accusations. Again, this is because elders are not better than other people, but we have vetted them, is the lack of the better word. That we've got somebody who is leading and looking up, and we're making sure that we don't just entertain these crazy accusations people will sometimes make. And then he goes even into those who don't rule so well in verse 20. This idea of rebuking them in the presence of everyone. It's not so much that, again, I'm going to stand up here and say, Tom is doing this, but the idea that we don't hide, if an elder sins, if an elder does something wrong, if they're in error, we don't sweep that under the rug and hide it. Because again, they're not better than us. And so, even as we increase the leadership here with more elders, if an elder makes a mistake, it's a public thing. And what Paul says here is it needs to be a public thing. He says that the rest may stand in fear or in respect for the word. Nobody is above the law. The elders are not the law. They are not above the law. They are still subject to it. And ideally, as we just make sure that everybody knows this, because elders come out from among us and they are still us, so they still get treated the same as far as this goes. Don't sweep it under the rug. Don't try to hide it. People make mistakes. We get them out in the open. We fix them. We move on. Isn't it a wonderful system? We ask for forgiveness and we're given it. And then the last section here is really just some things. I'll quickly go through these. These are really just some personal advice things that Paul gives to Timothy. In verse 21, he talks about a little bit of angels who are out there taking care of some things, that he keeps all the things that he's been talking about. Keep them without partiality. Don't play favorites as you're going through and keeping these rules. He goes about hasty recommendations. When it comes to verse 22, don't lay hands on anybody hastily. You just met somebody, you don't know them very well, don't give them a spiritual gift. Don't lay hands on somebody, or I'm sorry, it's not the spiritual gift. Timothy couldn't do that. I misspoke there. Just giving somebody your approval. The laying of hands was kind of a sign of approval that somebody was there. So you don't know this guy so well, don't vouch for him. Don't hastily recommend him so that you're not sharing in their sins. Keep yourself pure from it. And then I want to skip over the alcohol for the stomach problems. We'll get enough of that conversation. But talking about the sins and good works, in verses 24 and 25, he talks about the idea that, okay, some sins are just right out there in your face, clearly evident, and others, we're not going to know about them for a while. We'll find out about them in judgment. Sometimes it's real easy to see what somebody is doing, and sometimes they hide it so well we don't. God sees it, it'll come out in judgment. But the same things about this, he ends it kind of positively here. The same thing is true about good works. Sometimes you see the good work that somebody is really just pushing out there, and they're really doing a good job, and you notice it and you see it, and sometimes you won't even know till judgment that somebody made sure that your cupboard was always full. You didn't know who it was, and one day in judgment you'll find out so-and-so was feeding me all those years. So-and-so was protecting me all that time. So while sins and good works, sometimes we see them, they're right there in our face, and other times we won't know about them. The important thing kind of goes back to judging people based on what we see versus what we don't see. You'd never know it. I've met people who you'd never see them take a public part in worship. It just wasn't their thing. It wasn't their talent. But when they were gone, suddenly you noticed all the invisible things that they took care of. And I have a feeling that when judgment comes, we're going to learn the truth about a lot of people, about what they did for us that we didn't know about, and people who we called friends that did things against us we didn't know about. But he says there that some will be evident, some won't. We'll know it all one day. Just be careful about how we look at people when we don't know everything they're doing or everything they're not doing. So let's close with a word of prayer real quick.